A lot of people talk about, what are the critical issues facing young people growing up in what I would call under-resourced neighborhoods? What's the key issue? And, if you're on the political left, often you hear, it's education, or we need more jobs, more investment in the community. If you're on the right, it's more self-determination. It's pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's voucher programs. Other people might say that the big issue confronting young people growing up in a community like Camden is violence, or gangs, or drugs. And all are interesting and all important, but I remember a couple of years ago reading a book called Race Matters by Cornell West. And Cornell West teaches at Princeton University, sort of a social philosopher. He teaches in the Department of African American Studies. And in the book Race Matters, in one of the chapters, West talks about the key issue that is confronting young people growing up in the city. And he said, both those on the left and those on the right only have it partially right. And this is what he says. He says the great threat confronting young people growing up in communities like Camden is what he calls the nihilistic threat, nihilism. Nihilism, the nihilistic threat. And he goes on to give a definition, and I want you to hear this. Here's West's definition of the nihilistic threat. He says, nihilism is the lived experience of a life of horrifying lovelessness, meaninglessness, and hopelessness. And he goes on to say that a life without love, a life without meaning, and a life without hope leads to a numbing detachment from oneself and others that ultimately leads to the destruction of oneself and others. Hear it again. The nihilistic threat. A life of horrifying lovelessness, meaninglessness, and hopelessness. Now, this is not some abstract philosophical, this is not Nietzsche's descent into nothingness. This is a lived experience. And the longer that I spend in Camden and the more I travel to different communities around the world like Camden, the more I'm convinced that West is right. When I meet young people who have experienced lovelessness, meaningless, and hopelessness, you see that numbing detachment. And when you see kids at that state, it becomes frightening. So for the last 25 years, Urban Promise, we've been trying to figure out, how do we speak to these issues of love, meaning, and hope? And let me reduce love down to something very simple and very non-academic. This is what I think love means to kids who are thirsty for love. You ready? Very simple. Attention. One of my favorite days every semester is report card day. And I sit in my office on the corner of 36th and Federal, and I watch kids come up from Davis Elementary, and I know it's report card day because they're waving these yellow slips of paper. And they're coming to after-school program. And I remember a few years ago, I'm sitting in my office working on a fundraising letter, and this kid named Poncho comes up, and he leans against the door jamb, and he's got this yellow slip of paper hanging off his hip. I said, Poncho, what's that? Nothing. I said, hey, come here for a second, Poncho. What do you got in your hand? My report card. I said, can I look at it? He said, sure. I look at it, and he's got C's that have moved to B's and D's that have moved to C's. And I said, Poncho, this is fantastic. Can I go make a report, or can I go make a photocopy of your report card? And, this big smile, and I go down to the photocopier, make a copy, come back, fold it up. I give it to him, give him a big hug. I say, keep it up. I go back to my desk, and about 10 minutes later, I come out of the hall. Guess what? 2 doors down, there's Poncho, leaning against the door jamb with the yellow slip of paper hanging off his hip. And for the rest of the day, he just went around the office, hanging out with that slip of paper hanging off his hip. Why would a kid do that? Because he's thirsty for attention. We started a high school, an alternative high school, about 15 years ago for kids who had either dropped out of the public school or were 2-3 grade levels behind, and we'd have kids show up to our new high school. 90 days they had missed the previous year. And I remember going around to some of these kids, and I'd say, you guys, last year you missed 90 days of school. why are you here every day this year? And inevitably I'd hear this: Mr. Bruce, if I don't show up, somebody misses me. It's simple but profound. And so what West says is that if we are going to be an organization that speaks to this issue of lovelessness, we need to be organizations and churches that connect on a very personal level with young people. My buddy, Father Jeff, Jesuit priest, North Camden, runs a great program called HopeWorks. You walk into HopeWorks, it's this converted old row home. He's turned it into a computer center where kids are learning website design. But you walk in, the first thing you smell is bread baking. And then you see cats running around. And then you walk in and you see pictures of the kids and pictures of their website designs. And you can just feel the pride of the young people as they walk you around and show you their work and show you their pictures. Mother Teresa said, when asked about the poverty in America versus the poverty in India, she said, the poverty in America is much worse. She said, because it's the poverty of being nobody to anybody. Love. But the second thing, love is wonderful, but we also need to speak to this issue of meaning. Young people need more than just attention. Young people need more than just love, but young people need meaning in their lives. There's a scholar out of Northwestern University, John McKnight, who's done a lot of research on sort of asset-based approaches to community development. And what he says, which is wonderful, he says, people need more than services in their lives. People need more than a service life, because a service life doesn't necessarily make a meaningful life. And so one of the things that we've tried to do at Urban Promise is not just service kids, but we've tried to give young people a sense of meaning. We started this program a few years ago called the Street Leader Program, where we hire young people from the neighborhoods. And we train them to be mentors and tutors and coaches. And young people are catching a vision for transforming their own neighborhoods. They're giving something back. They're not just taking. And a few years ago, we partway through the summer, we ran out of money. And we do that a fair bit at Urban Promise. We live up to our name, a nonprofit. If we can pay our bills, we figure we're doing really well. We had 2 weeks left in the summer, and we didn't have money to pay the kids for the rest of the summer, and so I bring about 100 and 120 street leaders, these teen leaders from the neighborhood, into the church basement. I look out at them and I said, you guys, I got some bad news. I said, you've done a phenomenal job this summer, but we just don't have any money to pay you the last 2 weeks. So here's the deal. You can walk out that door at the back and take the rest of the summer off, and we'll make do without you. But I just can't guarantee that I'll be able to pay you. Nobody moves. I said, you guys, the door's there. I can't pay you. You're free to leave. I remember at one point, this kid puts up his hand. He says, Mr. Bruce, you really think we work here for the money? Well, I knew what we paid them. Obviously not. He said, take whatever you'd pay me and direct it to Shonda over here, because I know she really needs it. And somebody else put up their hand and said, yeah, I'll work for free. And all across the room, hands start going up. I don't need to get paid. And I realized what had happened. A job had become something meaningful. And the reason why our young people weren't getting up and leaving the room is because they had found meaning in their lives. They were making an impact on younger children in the community. But the last is this, and I'll end with this point, is hope. Art Levine wrote a book called Beating the Odds, How Poor Kids Get to College. And in the book, he traces 50 young people from the inner city of Boston who had made it to either MIT, Boston College, or Harvard. And he interviewed these young people because he wanted to find out, was there some consistent thread, some common denominator between these different students? And at the end of the research, he landed on this. All these kids that had made it from neighborhoods that traditionally didn't send kids to college could point to a person in their life who, in the words of Levine, validated their future. Young people need a sense of future. They need hope. Now, some of you may be saying, well, what about the gospel? Don't kids just need the Word of God? I agree with that. Yes, they need the Word of God, but they need to see hope. They need to play with hope. They need to sing with hope. They need to drive in the van with hope. They need to see hope embodied in people. Embodied in people. So West says, if we're going to be organizations, institutions, churches that are effective, we've got to speak to these deeper realities of love, meaning, and hope. In 1944, I'll close with this, there was a gentleman at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City named Mordecai Kaplan. And Mordecai Kaplan sensed that there was a crisis coming for his community of faith. In the wake of the Second World War, the centers in Poland and Lithuania and Germany that had produced generations of leaders had been decimated. So he gathered all these scholars and thinkers together and said, we've got a problem. If we don't address this leadership crisis, our community of faith will disappear. So these intellectuals began to think, what do we do? And they came up with this idea to start summer camps. And they wouldn't just be normal summer camps, but they would be camps where kids would come and they would get 90 minutes of religious instruction each day. They would observe dietary laws. They would do tutoring and homework, and they would do recreation. And so in 1949, in the North Woods of Wisconsin, Camp Ramah, which means New Heights in Hebrew, was birthed. And over the next 15 years, camps were started outside of New York, Los Angeles, and Boston. Well, this past summer, the grandchildren of the first participants in those camps began to attend. And those camps have produced a new generation of leaders for this community. I love that story because in the city, I believe we have a crisis. And we are seeing kids not realizing their potential, not realizing their God-given potential. And the religious community, the faith community, needs to come together with a vision. And that's what we've been trying to do at Urban Promise.